Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Hey everybody, this is Russ, and thanks so much for listening to the Key Chapters podcast. As you probably know, I'm on sabbatical right now, so what we're doing is we're uploading episodes from last year. That means the audio may not be great at times, or maybe even have some glitches here and there. So thank you for your grace and your patience, and I hope this podcast just continues to be a blessing to you in your walk with the Lord. So with that, here we go with today's episode. Today we're turning to the book of 1 Samuel. We'll be looking at chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. You've probably noticed that we have jumped out of the book of Judges, and we've even skipped over the book of Ruth, and now we're here in 1 Samuel. Why'd we do that? Well, ultimately, we are looking at the key chapters of the Bible, and although the rest of the book of Judges was filled with some really important things to understand about sin, I felt we really covered it pretty well yesterday in chapter 2. And the book of Ruth is great, but it is 4 chapters, and it's a wonderful story about a woman who is in just tremendous need and how a man named Boaz comes to help her, and how they have this wonderful relationship which ultimately produces their descendant David. But we're turning to chapter 1 of 1 Samuel today because 1 Samuel is an important book of the Old Testament. The theme of 1 Samuel is the theme of judges to kings. It covers 94 years from the birth of Samuel to the death of Saul. And it tells us the transition from when Israel goes from just being led by tribes and being led by judges to a single monarchy under God. The book opens with Israel just in this state of instability politically and spiritually. And you'll get a sense of this instability as we read 1 Samuel chapter 1 and chapter 2. We're seeing Eli. He's not going to really recognize what real heartfelt prayer looks like. In chapter 2, Eli's sons are just really disobedient and Eli's out of control. And so this was not a great season in the history of the Jewish people. And so God raises up Samuel. And Samuel is the last judge of the Jews, and he ushers in then the kingdom of Saul and later on David. 1 Samuel focuses on the ministry of Samuel as well as the kingship of Saul. Chapter 1 begins with Samuel's miraculous birth. Samuel is both a prophet and a judge for the Jewish people. He was also a Levite, and that's critical to know because only Levites could serve the Lord in the tabernacle. Well, let's talk about this passage. In many ways, if you've read it already, it's pretty straightforward. Verse 1 introduces us to Samuel's father, a man named Elkanah. Elkanah seems to be a decent dude. He kind of doesn't understand his wife and her pain, but he seems like he's pretty devout and pretty sincere. Verse 2 tells us that Elkanah had 2 wives, probably because Hannah could not bear children. Having more wife back then was permitted in the Old Testament because it was a concession that God allowed. But this passage here with Hannah and Peninnah, or Sarah and Hagar, or Leah and Rachel, all of those difficulties, remember those difficulties? They all show us that this was not a good situation for these families, that so much heartache and pain came from these dynamics. And we can see that pain as we go into verse 3. Verse 3 says that every year they go to Shiloh to worship the Lord. Now, for a little while, Shiloh was a religious center of Israel. It was about 30 miles north of Jerusalem. Jerusalem really wasn't the center of Israel back then, really even established. But Shiloh is where the tabernacle was set up. And you'll remember that the tabernacle was basically a mobile structure, almost like a tent. And at this point in the history of Israel, it seems like it was pretty much established that Shiloh is where it was and had even some other stuff attached to it. So it was really kind of the center of Jewish worship. Later on in the book of Jeremiah, the Lord tells us he was not pleased with Shiloh, so he just kind of got rid of it. Jeremiah 7 verses 12 to 14 says, "But go now to my place which was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel." And so the Lord brought an end to the ministry at Shiloh, and you can start to see why. This passage shows us a little bit, but it's going to become clearer as we go on through that this really wasn't a place of just deep religious stability and orthodoxy. So going on, in verses 4 and 5, Elkanah goes with his family to present an offering to the Lord. Now we know from what this offering contains that this was a peace offering. And you'll remember from Leviticus chapter 3 that a peace offering was a joyful, celebratory offering. It was the third offering in their set of offerings. Remember, they would first offer a sin offering just to deal with the sin before God, then the burnt offering, which would just show their dedication to the Lord, and finally the peace offering, which would just be a time of celebration of their fellowship with God, where they would eat together and with the priests, just with this one big feast. And so during this feast, Elkanah would give Hannah, his wife, a double portion, just to show her how much he loved her, despite the fact that the Lord had closed her womb. Now notice that phrase, closed her womb. It's mentioned twice here, once in verse 5 and once in verse 6. And the Lord did something similar with Sarah in Genesis 16:2 and Rachel in Genesis 30 verse 2. And it just shows us that the Lord is sovereign over these matters. And so because Hannah could not have any children, she was constantly at odds with Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah. Verse 6 even calls them rivals. And so you have this tragic reality here that one woman is childless and totally qualified to have children. The other woman has tons of children, but clearly it's just not of a righteous disposition. And so this whole conflict there in verse 7 produces so much pain in Hannah's heart that she could not eat and she just would weep. Apparently, Elkanah is clueless about her pain because he says to her, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" I mean, what kind of question is that? Not the best question for a husband to ask his wife as she's grieving. And so in verse 9, she goes to the tabernacle, which apparently is sometimes called the temple, and she prays to the Lord. And in verse 10, it says she wept bitterly, which is literally to weep, she wept. It's just a Hebrew way of showing how much pain she was in. To weep, she wept. Well, we can read her prayer in verse 11. It says she called upon the Lord of hosts. That term Lord of hosts is a special title used first here in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And it's a title of the Lord that just declares that all of heaven and earth submits to him. So we have here the first time this is used here. First time we see it on the lips of a person is on Hannah's lips. And she is just recognizing God's glorious reign and rule. She also recognizes that she is his servant. And she makes a vow to him that if he were to give her a son, she would dedicate that son to him. And the way she describes the son, we know it's a Nazirite. But unlike a normal Nazirite vow, which is like just for a short period of time, she promises to dedicate him to the Lord for his entire life. And so you've got this wonderful spiritual work being done in this prayer. And yet Eli, the guy in charge of all this, is just oblivious. And so in verse 12, he sees her praying, and he assumes, well, she must be drunk, and he scolds her. And I can only think that the spiritual condition of Israel at this point was such that Eli wasn't very accustomed to seeing people actually praying before the Lord at the tabernacle. I don't know what was going on. Maybe they always spoke out loud, or maybe just it didn't happen often. And so Eli sees her praying, assumes she's drunk, and scolds her. But then once Hannah explains she's not drunk, she's praying, he changes his tone and he says to her in verse 17, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition you asked of him." And so she stops praying, she stops fasting because she was fasting during this time, and she goes back and she joins her family. Then in verse 20, she becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to a boy that she names Samuel. And the name Samuel is kind of hard for scholars to translate, but it means something along the lines of asked from God. And so, of course, Hannah had been asking the Lord for Samuel, and now the Lord has provided him, and so that's her name for him. Well, Hannah weans Samuel, and then presents him to the Lord in verse 24. And she goes back to Shiloh with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a jug of wine. And you'll remember from our offering study that this is just a combination of an offering that is used specifically of fulfilling a vow. Numbers 15 verses 8 to 10 talks about it. But when Hannah is bringing all this stuff back, she is actually bringing larger quantities. And this just shows her and Elkanah's excitement and joy about having Samuel as their son. And so they present him to the Lord here at the temple. He's probably a toddler, 3 or something years old. And she gives him to the Lord as a gift. And it wasn't that she totally abandoned him. 1 Samuel 2:19 says she would go back to visit him. But she is leaving Samuel there to serve the Lord. And then the next chapter opens with Hannah's beautiful prayer of thanks and praise to the Lord. So that's the chapter here, though, for just chapter 1 today. Just a couple things to point out. First, we're seeing here that Hannah was fasting as she was praying. Sometimes I think of fasting as like giving up chocolate for a day or two or something like that. We see here really what goes into fasting. Fasting is to set aside food so that we can devote ourselves to the Lord and just seek him. It's to be so burdened with something that we just gotta just meet with God and pray to him and seek him and read his word. And what's interesting is she is fasting in this passage from the peace offering that the rest of the family is celebrating. So clearly she is grieved about not having children. She is grieved about the trouble she's having with Peninnah. And so she's fasting and praying and just focusing on the Lord. And as she has brought all of these concerns before him, he has put her heart at ease, and she's then able to go back to her family and join them in this celebratory feast. We also see here the godly heritage of a godly mother. Hannah is obviously a godly woman. She is showing restraint in her words. She is pouring her heart before the Lord. She is fasting. She's even uncommon in her godliness because Eli doesn't seem to really get what's going on when he first meets her. But we're seeing that God has honored her, God has heard her prayers, and we're seeing the heritage that she has left in her son Samuel, because Samuel grows up to be a hero of the Old Testament. So many of the characters of the Old Testament have kind of blights on their character. You think about Abraham or Isaac or later on David, and they all have these kind of blights that are just you have to deal with. Samuel doesn't have those. As far as I know, Samuel has an impeccable character. He's not sinless, of course, but he is a man where there is no major character flaw. And I believe a lot of that comes from Hannah, her prayers, and the heritage of this godly woman being poured into her son. Likewise, this is a reminder that when we have poured out our heart before the Lord and when we are grieved, we know that God hears our prayers. He responds. It might be in His time, and it may not be the response that we were hoping for, but His ways are always right, always best for the situation, always what bring Him the most glory, and ultimately it brings us the most joy. And like Hannah, we need to just pray and bring our thoughts to Him, bring a request to Him, but also leave them there knowing that the solution and the timing is all up to the Lord and what He believes is best. And then we can get on up and live our lives joyfully in fellowship, praising God, even if we don't always get the answer that we were hoping for. And so those are some thoughts on 1 Samuel chapter 1 about just this wonderful woman and her godly prayers and her just desire to love and serve the Lord, and how the Lord blesses her with this great little guy named Samuel. And we're going to spend the next few days just looking at who he becomes, the man of God he becomes as he leads the children of Israel back to faithfulness to the Lord. With that, hope you have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.